Hi, everyone. Well, I'll get us started. So thank you today for coming to our webinar on understanding and responding to the transit needs of women. In Canada, I'm David Cooper, Principal Lead Mobility Consulting. I'll be the English moderator for today's webinar. This project is a collaboration between the University of Alberta, the Polytechnique Montréal, and Leading Mobility Consulting. We'd like to thank our funders from the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council and Infrastructure Canada for supporting us in undertaking the study. We took a multidisciplinary approach to the lens of planning and engineering for this study. This project was inspired by the landmark study, understanding how women travel by Los Angeles Metro, and we're quite delighted to have one of the project leads for that study with us today on our panel. Our team of researchers and practitioners care deeply about the mobility justice of women, and we are pleased that approximately over 200 of our peers and colleagues from across Canada are joining us today to learn about our findings. I'd like to turn over to our French moderator, Professor Geneviève Beaujoly, for her opening remarks.
Bonjour tout le monde, merci de vous être joints à nous aujourd'hui pour ce webinaire sur comprendre et répondre aux besoins des femmes en transport en commun au Canada. Donc, c'est un projet conjoint de Polytechnique Montréal, Leading Mobility et University of Alberta. Donc, il y aura du bilinguisme dans cette session au mieux de nos possibilités. C'est un projet qui est financé par Infrastructure Canada et le Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines. Donc, on les remercie grandement. Puis, on a été inspiré par un travail, une recherche qui a été faite par l'Agence de transport en commun de Los Angeles aux États-Unis, dont la co-autrice est présente aujourd'hui. Donc, on est bien contente de pouvoir vous présenter nos résultats justement sur les besoins des femmes en transport en commun à travers le Canada et comment ils sont inclus dans la planification des transports. Et juste une petite note, donc l'introduction va être faite dans les deux langues. Pour ce qui est de la présentation des résultats, pour ne pas s'étirer trop longtemps, ça va être fait en anglais, mais les diapositives vont être en français et en anglais. Et pour les questions et réponses, bien, ce sera 100% bilingue, donc les questions et les réponses pourront être faites dans le langage du choix des panélistes et des participants, puis je m'assurerai de synthétiser dans l'autre langue là, pour s'assurer que tout le monde puisse suivre pleinement dans la langue de son choix. Donc, je passe la parole à David pour la prochaine diapo.
Thanks, Jen. Today we'll be walking through our findings of the study, specifically with a literature and policy review and a report overview presented by Priyanka Babar. The report findings will be presented in English with French text provided on each slide. After the presentation of our findings, we'll have a discussion with our esteemed panel of female transit leaders who we will be introducing shortly. Panel discussion will be both in English and French. Each question will be asked in both English and French, and the panelists will be welcome to answer the question in the language of their choice during the moderated Q&A, as well as the audience Q&A. And then the panelist answer will be translated for the audience. After the moderated panel's discussion, we will open up to the floor so you can ask questions of either our panel or the broader research team.
Donc, if you can get back to the... Yeah. Merci. Donc, pour ce qui est du déroulement du webinaire aujourd'hui, donc, on va commencer avec un aperçu des résultats là, du rapport sur lequel on travaille depuis 1 an. Donc, c'est un projet multidisciplinaire sur lequel on a travaillé, puis on espère dans le futur agrandir notre approche multidisciplinaire. Donc, suivant la présentation des résultats, il va y avoir une discussion des 4 panélistes qui sont présentes aujourd'hui. On les remercie grandement. Et on va terminer avec des questions et des réponses du public. Donc, comme je le mentionnais, sentez-vous bien à l'aise de poser la question dans la langue de votre choix. Et en terminant, on va parler des prochaines étapes. Qu'est-ce qu'on entrevoit pour la suite de ce projet sur mieux comprendre et intégrer les besoins des femmes dans la planification des transports en commun.
I'd just like to do a quick introduction of the project team. So I'd like to introduce Professor Emily Grise. She's our principal investigator and assistant professor at the School of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Alberta. We have Professor Geneviève Beaujoly, assistant professor at the Department of Geology and Civil Engineering at the Polytechnique of Montréal. We have Priyanka Babar, who is the graduate research assistant from the School of Urban and Regional Planning, as well as Joseph Peace, assistant transportation planner for Leading Mobility Consulting.
Donc, brièvement, l'équipe de projet qui travaille sur ces questions de recherche depuis un bout. Donc, il y a professeur Émilie Grisé de l'Université d'Alberta, qui est la principale chercheuse dans le projet. Il y a Priyanka Babar, qui est une assistante de recherche, ainsi que Joseph Peace, assistant de recherche aussi, qui ont vraiment effectué un travail hors pair dans le cadre de ce projet, et David Cooper et moi, qui travaillent aussi sur le projet.
And we're absolutely delighted to have an awesome panel for you today to share our findings, but also talk about the work that transit agencies are doing to advance women's travel patterns and experiences on public transit. We have Christine Gauvreau, who's the Director of Planning from the Société de Transport de Laval, just outside of Montreal. We have Elba Higueros, who is the Chief Policy Officer at Los Angeles Metro and the chair of LA Metro's Women and Girls Governing Council, and also project lead of the Understanding How Women Travel report. We have Carrie Houghton McDonald, branch manager of Edmonton Transit Service. We have Sheila PZ Allen, who is the executive director of TTC Riders in Toronto.
Donc, comme je le mentionnais plus tôt, on est vraiment content d'avoir 4 panélistes incroyable pour participer à cet effort, puis un peu discuter de ce qui se fait dans chacune des agences de transport en commun pour vraiment intégrer les besoins des femmes dans la planification des services de transport en commun. Donc, il y a Christine Groveau, la directrice de planification et développement de la Société de transport de Laval, juste à côté de Montréal. Il y a Elba Higueros, qui est la directrice des politiques pour Los Angeles Metro, puis, comme je le mentionnais, qui a travaillé directement là, sur le rapport exhaustif sur l'analyse des besoins des femmes, de la mobilité des femmes dans la région de Los Angeles. Il y a aussi Carrie Houghton McDonald, qui est directrice de Edmonton Transit Service, qui est aussi l'agence de transport en commun de Edmonton. Et finalement, Sheila Pizé Allen, qui est directrice exécutive de TTC Riders, qui est un groupe justement qui regroupe les usagers du transport en commun à Toronto.
And now I'll turn it over to Priyanka, who's going to walk us through the report findings.
Donc maintenant, on laisse la parole à Priyanka qui va nous guider à travers les résultats de notre étude jusqu'à maintenant.
So, hello everyone. We are pleased to be sharing our work on the travel needs and behaviors of women. What inspired this project is the idea that women are primary users of transit. And for many agencies, women make up a majority of riders, such as for the Toronto Transit Commission, where 56% of riders are women. In addition to this, as we have seen through the pandemic, women have continued to use transit. And so understanding and responding to the needs of this key demographic is important for planning and practice. Safety is one aspect that has been studied extensively in the academic literature. And from this, public transit agencies have recognized that safety is a key component of travel experience and have delivered initiatives to specifically improve the safety and perception of security for women. So part of the motivation for this study was to build on this safety-related work by understanding how women's needs can further be understood and thereby incorporated in public transit planning and service delivery. Despite our examination of women as one group, we would like to acknowledge that women is not a homogeneous term, and therefore the examination of women as one group is not to take away from the lived experience of migrant, LGBTQ+, disabled, or women of color who may exhibit different travel patterns. So the objectives that guided this project were to, 1, understand the differentiated needs and experiences of women's travel, and 2, understand the current practice of how women's distinct travel needs are considered within Canadian transit planning. A mixed methodology approach was used to achieve these objectives. First, a literature review of both gray and academic research was done. Literature examined had female, women, or gender in the title to ensure women or the gendered experience of travel was the main focus of the literature. Furthermore, travel by all modes was examined, as this left space to consider external pressures that influence women's use or non-use of public transit. The review, however, was restricted to materials pertaining to the global north for contextual consistency and was restricted to variables of women's travel aside from safety. We did this to ensure we tapped into more understudied aspects of women's travel. We then undertook an assessment of policy materials that were produced by and or guided the activities of 18 of the largest public transit agencies in Canada. Materials such as customer satisfaction surveys, service standards, transportation master plans, business cases, and more from public transit agencies were examined. These agencies are from the 8 largest census metropolitan areas in Canada. And for census areas with more than one agency, agencies with an annual ridership of 10 million and greater were included. The documents examined in the policy review were primarily found through desktop research and therefore were publicly available materials. To supplement this, representatives from all 18 agencies were contacted and were invited to provide additional materials. Nonetheless, after collection of all the materials, a systematic keyword search of terms related to gender were used to identify how and where a gender lens was incorporated, and from that, trends and themes were identified. Finally, to complement the research components of this study, findings from today's panel discussion of industry experts will be incorporated into the final report. So here we just have a list of the 18 transit agencies we researched and assessed for the policy review in this study. As noted, these transit agencies were selected as they operate in the 8 largest CMAs in Canada and carry more than 10 million customers per year. The final report will discuss findings from both the desktop research and the additional materials that were provided by the transit agencies, but we would like to make clear that interviews were not conducted in this study due to the time, duration, and budget of the project. Interviews, however, could be included as a research component in different future studies. And now this leads us to our findings. So one of the major and most overarching findings within the literature was the idea that because gender roles impact women's standing within labor markets, family structures, and broader society, it then also has influence on women's travel behavior and needs. So some common patterns in women's travel behavior is the greater propensity to travel during midday or at off-peak times. This can be attributed to the fact that women are more likely to be caregivers, as 54% of caregivers in Canada are women. The tasks associated with caregiving, such as shopping or chauffeuring, are more convenient to take at off-peak times because it is less crowded on public transit vehicles. This makes carrying large loads or traveling with a stroller much easier. Traveling off-peak can also be attributed to part-time employment, in which women are more likely to be represented. Part-time work leads to more sporadic commute times in comparison to established peak periods that are commonly used in transportation planning. Women on average also do 1.5 more hours of domestic work per day as compared to men, and this is in tandem with an increasing participation in the paid workforce. This leads to many women being time poor and choosing efficient travel schemas such as trip chaining. Trip training is the process of completing 2 or more activities in a single outing. Also for efficiency, literature shows that women are more likely to choose jobs that are in close proximity to the home. This reduces the time lost during long commutes and contributes to patterns of shorter distance travel. To add on to this, the domestic and caregiving related duties that women are typically more responsible for tend to be more localized, such as going grocery shopping, to doctor's appointments, or to school drop-off and pickup. So these localized activities contribute to short distance travel patterns as well. The balancing of home and employment responsibilities leads to women being more likely to take a greater number of trips overall compared to men. The dynamics of employment, social, and family structures impact women's travel in various ways. Therefore, understanding these complexities gives insights to the travel behaviors commonly exhibited by women. So because of the interrelationship between academia and practice, it is important to acknowledge gaps within the literature. First, additional research on the travel behavior of women in the Canadian context is needed. With this, there was also limited information and research available that focused on the travel behavior of migrant women, women of color, women with disabilities, or LGBTQ+ women, and just how different types of women travel differently. From a data standpoint, a large proportion of the literature was centered around commute travel, but by also collecting data about caregiving related travel, this would provide a more holistic picture of women's travel behavior. And lastly, the use of surveys was well established within the literature. And so for further progression, novel studies using large data sets from GPS or smart card information can provide more quantitative support on how women travel. So our literature review really gave us the foundation for understanding women's travel behavior and needs, which then guided the policy review component of the study. So preliminary findings from the policy review highlighted areas where opportunities exist for public transit agencies to respond to the travel needs of women. First, many public transit agencies are implementing service improvements that from our research we found are aligned with the transit needs of women. But in the policy surrounding these service changes, women are not explicitly listed as the beneficiaries of it. For example, the Toronto Transit Commission's time-based transfer policy is conducive to trip chaining. Similarly, fare policies that have been implemented by other agencies such as TransLink are favorable to women who take short distance trips. What these examples show us is that analyzing potential service changes, including improvements, through a gender lens will provide insight into how women are impacted, as well as improve accountability in future decisions surrounding service changes. Second, we found opportunities in the collection and use of gender data. Detailed ridership and trip data would assist planners and policymakers in monitoring and implementing policies that meet the transportation needs of women. Third, review of publicly available service standards suggests that there is a mismatch between the services that meet women's needs and the standards outlined. For instance, peak periods where services are more frequent are not aligned with the predominant off-peak travel periods for women. While there is still work to be done, these preliminary findings show tremendous opportunity for agencies to support women's transit needs. These findings will be refined as we continue our research towards the publication of the final report later this year. As part of the policy review, best practices have been identified among public transit agencies, and some key examples include the TransLink Metro Vancouver Regional Trip Diary Dashboard, where the results from the household travel survey are presented by gender for primary mode and trip purpose. The results are gender disaggregated and presented in a publicly viewable dashboard, allowing findings to be accessible and transparent. From the Toronto Transit Commission, we have a diversity and inclusion lens toolkit. These resources provide a framework for considering how decisions will impact women. The City of Ottawa has adopted a similar program, the Equity and Inclusion Lens, which applies to OC Transpo. This program requires evaluation of how decisions impact marginalized peoples. At the ARTM, they had gender representation in consultation processes during the creation of the strategic development plan. Hearing directly from women and including them in major planning decisions allows for new perspectives to be heard and incorporated. And lastly, at the City of Edmonton, they had a transit operator recruitment campaign, where they intended to hire more women into transit operator roles. This initiative was brought forward through a recognition that women working in these roles would be better equipped to relate to and convey the experiences and needs of women riders. The synthesis of the academic and preliminary policy findings have led to the following emerging recommendations. In no particular order, first, we recommend exploring novel avenues for real-time gender-based data collection. Gender disaggregated data is crucial for informed planning and decision-making that supports women's travel needs. Almost all of the public transit agencies considered in this study use a smart fare collection system. Therefore, opportunities may exist to use these systems to collect ridership and trip data by gender. Smartphone or GPS applications may also be another space to explore gender-specific data collection. Second, we recommend leveraging customer satisfaction surveys to collect gender-specific data on service. Transit agencies regularly undertake customer satisfaction surveys, and there is an opportunity to incorporate more gender-specific questions that pertain to service attributes, such as frequency of service, span of service, or overall trip time. Having this feedback would allow for a better understanding of the service needs of women. Third, we recommend implementing gender-informed metrics to service standards. By defining performance indicators directly from the travel behavior of women, public transit agencies can better meet the needs of women. An example of an equity-based service standard can be seen with the Toronto Transit Commission and Durham Region Transit, where a ridership multiplier is used to give higher weighting to services that directly impact certain equity-seeking communities. A similar approach could be looked at for services that are known through ridership data to have a higher proportion of women riders. Fourth, we recommend incorporating a gender lens as part of the introduction of new transit technologies. So when in times of project development, for example, when upgrading or creating a smart card system, looking for ways to integrate the collection of gender-based data while balancing the needs for privacy will work to provide novel and greater amounts of gender-specific data. And lastly, we recommend integrating gender equity evaluations into business cases and planning. This would provide insight into the ways that projects impact women, as well as increase transparency in how the metrics of a project are evaluated. An example of this in practice is the new gender-based analysis requirement for business case submissions in the Investing in Canada infrastructure program. Overall, this study builds on existing work by those both in academic and practitioner spaces and contributes to a larger conversation on women's travel needs. Gender equity is an emerging topic across industries, and transit practitioners have a great opportunity to be leaders in this space. As transit agencies recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, it will be increasingly important to sustain ridership and ensure service for those most reliant on it. Public transit services are vital for accessibility and mobility, so working to meet the transportation needs of women contributes to more equitable and inclusive services. With dialogue and continued conversation between academics, practitioners, and members of the public, we can share best practices and maximize opportunities that fulfill women's transportation needs and improve transit experience and usage. So that brings me to the end of this presentation. Thank you for listening. And now I will pass it over to David, who's going to discuss the next steps for this project.
Thank you, Priyanka, for walking us through the report findings recommendations. So in terms of next steps, we're working to finalize a report in the last quarter of this year. We'll be submitting it to Infrastructure Canada and SSHRC at that time. I'll be sharing the final findings and recommendations at the SSHRC's Knowledge Mobilization Virtual Forum coming up. Also pleased to announce that we've been accepted into the TRB 2022 conference, presenting our findings there as well. And then there'll be continued outreach from the project team to transit agencies that would like to explore areas of further studies. That this is very meaningful work that we really much want to continue with our agency partners. In terms of questions, if you have any questions specifically about the research program, please contact Dr. Emily Grisey at the University of Alberta. Her email address is provided there. And then if there's any questions about the transit agency policy review, you can direct them to myself. We will also be circulating this presentation to all the attendees of this webinar, and it'll be posted online as well. Now I'm going to turn it over to our moderated panel. So I'll invite our panelists to turn their cameras on, and then we'll walk through a series of moderated questions. This will also provide attendees time to provide questions in the Q&A box. So we'll be going through a series of questions right now, and if you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the Q&A box. So I will turn over to our panel and start the discussion. So the first question is for Alba. So Alba, as a co-author of the Understanding How Women Travel report for Los Angeles Metro, could you speak to the significance of the research with an explicit focus on women's transportation needs, particularly in terms of public transit?
Yes, so thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. It was really exciting to hear about your findings and the next steps for your program. Those findings are very similar to what we found in LA with our How Women Travel study. So that's exciting that we're finding the same issues and are developing, solutions to these issues to better improve the transportation for women. And so I think what's really important is that we're all working to develop an equitable system and to put into action the recent research into practice. So just some really quick findings from our 2019 report. We took the initiative in 2019 to ask the question of how are women using our system, understanding that women were a majority of our riders and they use our system more than men. You know, our industry has taken a gender neutral approach to how we design, plan, and operate our systems. And we've historically assumed that our systems and service equally benefit men and women, and that there's minimal difference between how they use the system and the travel needs. And so based on a lot of research and these reports, we know that that's not true, that women experience mobility differently. And so we've had an incomplete picture on how women are using our system and the mobility challenges that they're encountering accessing our services. So one of the most, important takeaways is collecting the data. I know a lot of transit agencies have a lot of data, but what is not happening is that we're not disaggregating that data by gender. So we're not getting a real picture on how women are using our system. We have an incomplete picture, and that's the first issue that we need to overcome. I know it was mentioned about the need for surveys and focus groups, and I think that's really important as part of our study. We had specific focus groups and surveys, and to really get that lived experience is really important and key in moving towards an equitable system. And again, as mentioned in your study and findings, the importance of applying a gender lens into all the work that we do. So very similar findings in our report. We know that women are less likely to have access to a car, are more reliant on transit to complete their day-to-day tasks with work, children, and household errands. And that data helped us to adjust our services and frequencies to better meet the travel needs. And as mentioned, women are more likely to trip chain and are more likely to take shorter trips, but multiple trips. And they're more likely to travel during non-peak hours. So understanding the trip purposes, it informed us on how to look at our bus stops, our transit vehicles, our transit stations, so that they could be designed in a way that meet the needs of women and for the purposes that their trips are. Also key and most important is safety concerns. They really influence how women are traveling, really changing when they're traveling, how they're traveling, sometimes impacting the mobility choice that they make, and sometimes that choice is more expensive. So there's a real focus on addressing concerns of safety, and understanding also access is another barrier, whether it be fare policy or design of vehicles, and the challenges with traveling with children. So the takeaway is that we need to continue to do the research, continue to ask the questions, and understand that women are using our system differently, and we need to design and operate our system in that way. So hopefully that answered your question.
No, it definitely did. There's so many different elements to it, from the research to service design, and our project is really starting the conversation to take stock of what we're doing and the opportunities to move forward. And it was very impressive reading the LA Metro study. It was very eye-opening professionally and personally for myself, just seeing not only there was the research component, but the focus groups and the lived experience, and kind of walking through that journey was, I think, very powerful, and definitely, I know personally opened up my eyes a lot to the importance of this work, for sure. Jen?
Yes, well, thanks, Alba. First, in English. Merci, Alba, pour la réponse à cette question. Donc, la question s'adressait à Elba Higueros, qui est co-autrice du rapport Understanding How Women Travel in LA. Et on voulait en savoir plus sur la pertinence qu'elle entrevoyait d'entreprendre des recherches qui mettent l'accent explicitement sur les besoins des femmes en transport en général, mais aussi en transport en commun. Et donc maintenant, je vais faire mon possible là, pour résumer la réponse d'Elba. Notez que je ne suis pas une traductrice professionnelle, donc je vais vraiment faire de mon mieux. En gros, ce qu'elle mentionnait, c'est que les résultats de notre étude sont très semblables à leurs résultats. Donc, on voit des tendances qui sont les mêmes dans différentes villes, dans différents pays. Puis, elle mettait l'accent sur l'importance de développer des recherches et afin de comprendre comment les femmes utilisent le transport commun, sachant qu'elles l'utilisent en plus grande proportion que les hommes et qu'elles l'utilisent différemment. Donc, très important de continuer la recherche pour comprendre ça. Et très important aussi de mettre en pratique des interventions qui répondent à ce qu'on comprend des recherches. Aussi, Elba mentionnait qu'il y a des directives très claires au sein de LA depuis quelques années qui visent à développer des politiques neutres quant au genre, donc qui bénéficient autant aux femmes qu'aux hommes. Et c'est particulièrement important étant donné que les femmes utilisent en plus grande proportion les transports en commun. Puis, le premier défi à relever qui a été noté, c'est la collecte de données. En général, la collecte de données est faite de façon agrégée où c'est difficile d'avoir des informations spécifiques sur les déplacements par rapport au genre. Donc, ça, c'est un premier défi à relever. Puis, je pense que les autres panélistes vont être d'accord avec ce résultat-là. Un autre défi important, c'est de comprendre l'expérience vécue. Donc, au-delà des chiffres, au-delà des données, de s'intéresser vraiment à l'expérience vécue par les femmes. Et deux points qui revenaient beaucoup dans l'étude, c'était le sentiment de sécurité et l'accessibilité du transport en commun, que ce soit le design des véhicules, le coût d'utilisation, les tarifs d'utilisation du transport en commun. Et en terminant, Elba mentionnait que les femmes, dans le principal résultat de leur étude, c'est que les femmes avaient des déplacements plus complexes, donc plus de déplacements plus courts qui impliquent des chaînes de déplacement aussi, comme on a trouvé aussi. Et la piste la perspective de recherche qu'elle proposait, c'est de s'intéresser aux motifs de déplacement des femmes. Donc, pourquoi les femmes font des déplacements et quels sont les défis que ça engendre. Donc, je crois que ça résume un peu la réponse de Elba. Je vais laisser la parole à David pour la suite des questions.
Thank you, Jen. So next question is for all panelists. And if you'd like to answer this question, just please unmute your mic. So what can transportation and public transit professionals do to illuminate the distinct transportation needs of women?
Donc, pendant que les panélistes prennent un moment pour réfléchir, je vais traduire la question. Donc, la question vise à savoir, ça s'adresse à tous les panélistes, puis vise à explorer comment est-ce que les professionnels en transport peuvent contribuer à avoir une meilleure compréhension, justement, des femmes en transport en commun.
I can probably get started. So hello from Treaty 6 territory in sunny Edmonton, Alberta. So when I think about how to illuminate and kind of highlight this, for me, it starts with leadership. So I think, making sure we have diverse voices at the leadership level within our transit agencies, reflecting the diverse communities we serve, including women, by having those voices and then encouraging dialogue and analysis at the leadership level, it's a bit of a ripple effect. I think it can then, translate over into the different kind of sections of transit agencies. It needs to form, the reports that we're doing for our boards and our councils, any policy work that we're doing in service design. So really, factoring those voices in from the start. So not just during consultations or public engagement, but actually trying to reflect that diversity ourselves and lead by example. And that intersectional perspective. And I love that was highlighted through the presentation, really thinking about the intersection of different factors. So elderly women who are, let's say, racially diverse, et cetera. So thinking a bit more broadly, not just, the fact that women as a collective have needs, but then what are the subset of needs that are out there? So that's where I would start, is focusing again at the leadership level.
Thanks, Carrie, for that interesting and very high. Now I'm having trouble speaking in English and French and at the same time, so I'll stick with the French for now. Donc, Carrie a dit qu'une des choses importantes qu'ils faisaient dans leur agence de transport en commun, c'est d'avoir des voix féminines au niveau du leadership donc dans différentes sections, par exemple, des agences de transport en commun, pour s'assurer que la diversité hommes-femmes soit reflétée dès le début, puis vraiment au centre de la planification. Donc, la consultation des usagers, c'est super important, mais ça arrive souvent pas nécessairement en amont de la planification, donc de refléter vraiment la diversité dans l'ensemble de la planification. Ça a beaucoup de potentiel. Puis elle mentionnait aussi l'importance de l'intersectionnalité. Donc, au-delà de refléter la diversité homme-femme, c'est aussi important de refléter au sein de l'Agence de transport en commun les différents groupes de femmes, par exemple, quand on parle au niveau de l'âge, au niveau d'origine ethnique, ça peut influencer les perspectives et les expériences vécues.
Thank you, Carrie, for sharing your thoughts on that. I'm going to move to the next question, and this question's for Sheila. Sheila, TTC riders advocate for equitable access to public transit. In what ways can decision-making in transportation and public transit planning be more responsive, accountable, and transparent to women's transportation needs?
Thanks. Yeah, I want to speak a bit about some of the emerging recommendations, but first, I guess the main point I want to make is that transit agencies really need to be talking to transit users. And if we rely on big data alone from smart card systems, we'll really miss out on hearing from people who face barriers to accessing smart cards or using transit for other reasons. So, for example, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has written to Metrolinx and TTC about the barriers to accessing Presto, whether it's geographic, people who live in the inner suburbs, people who have digital or financial barriers to using smart cards. So that's an important piece. There are also language barriers. So some of the methods that we might use to survey people or use big data aren't always going to reach people who rely on transit the most. So TTC Riders is a membership-based organization of transit users, and we build the power of transit riders to take collective action and win more accessible transit. And one thing we did this year was a report based on focus group conversations with over 300 transit users in multiple languages. And the focus was on fare policy, but a lot of safety issues and other issues affecting women came up, and there were insights that we couldn't have discovered unless we had talked to transit users all across the city. So, majority of people we spoke to were women, and to speak about some of the ideas people brought up really speak to one of the recommendations around service standards, which I think is a great recommendation, to have public service standards and to have them be informed by gender equity. So some of the ideas people brought up were well-lit bus stops, more frequent night bus service, having crowding standards be informed by space on buses for strollers and getting groceries, so grocery carts. Other pieces around stop consolidation. So if you're removing stops, are you removing a stop that's near a daycare center, a grocery store, a space that's important that women access, that maybe doesn't have high ridership, but that's about women's access. Another thing I'd add is, in addition to service standards, just having clear public policies around certain protocols like sexual assault on transit. What happens? People expressed as well in a Mandarin focus group we had just their concerns about the rise in anti-Asian racism during the pandemic and fear around using public transit and just not knowing what's the protocol. So all of these pieces are important, but I'll also add that I don't think they're a silver bullet. Like, there are service standards at the TTC that are not being met. So they only go so far if there's not the political will to enforce them. And I'm happy to share like an example later about some service standards we've seen not be enforced. But that's, I think, an important piece. And another point I wanted to raise about surveys, that's very important. That's referenced as a recommendation. But, to really reach people who depend on transit the most, online surveys, aren't going to reach them. There needs to be a different approach, and one that's resourced. People don't have time to attend public consultations, and people don't want to attend public consultations where they know they have no power, that a public consultation box is being ticked off. What they say won't have an influence. And I wanted to share, I really love this book by Stephen Higashide. He has an example from Metro Transit in Minneapolis that resource community organizations who have relationships to residents as they redesign their Better Bus Stops program, like a Stop Amenities program. And I know the TTC has done this with youth engagement teams as well. So yeah, just to sum up, talking to transit users, but recognizing the limits that a lot of the planning decisions are also political decisions. And yeah.
As a planner, I appreciate your answer. It's very challenging to resource consultation and surveys, but it's so vital to get that data to make sure we have all the voices at the table. And it's something that myself and many others have been pushing for, because we need to fully understand, you know, the needs of everyone who needs to take public transit, and some of those traditional means don't work to fully get that picture. So thank you for that, Sheila.
Thank you, Sheila. So I'll try to summarize at my best. So, la question portait, sachant que Sheila, que le groupe dans lequel elle travaille milite pour un accès équitable au transport en commun, la question visait à comprendre de quelle façon est-ce que la prise de décision et la planification des transports et transports en commun peut être plus sensible, redevable et transparente. Donc, Sheila a commenté beaucoup sur les recommandations qu'on a faites, et son point principal, c'était le besoin de parler directement avec les usagers, donc d'aller au-delà des données massives comme les cartes à puce, par exemple, donc d'utiliser différentes sources de données de façon complémentaire, particulièrement pour rejoindre les usagers plus vulnérables ou qu'on entend moins. Et à ce niveau-là, elle parlait aussi des sondages qui, par exemple, les enquêtes de satisfaction ou les sondages qu'on fait auprès des usagers, c'est important d'aller rejoindre ceux qui utilisent le TC le plus. Donc, elle mentionnait certaines limites là, des consultations publiques ou des consultations en ligne, que ce soit en termes d'accès à la technologie ou de temps ou de réticence à participer, par exemple, aux consultations publiques si les personnes sentent qu'elles ne seront pas entendues ou que leur participation n'amènera pas de changement. Et comme exemple, Sheila mentionnait une étude là, qu'ils ont fait à travers l'Ontario, si je me rappelle bien, sur les tarifs des transports en commun, et qui a permis vraiment de rejoindre une multitude, une diversité d'usagers vraiment en utilisant une approche multilingue. Et un des résultats principaux, c'est que beaucoup des gens, même si l'étude portait sur les tarifs, beaucoup parlaient des standards de service. Donc, d'avoir plus de services de nuit, d'avoir des normes d'achalandage, par exemple, qui vont limiter ou compliquer l'utilisation du transport en commun si on a une poussette ou un chariot d'épicerie, par exemple. Et un autre aspect important qui est sorti, c'est celui d'avoir des protocoles clairs quant aux différentes politiques des usagers des agences de transport en commun. Elle parlait notamment du harcèlement lié au genre ou à l'origine ethnique. Quand ça arrive, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Donc, d'informer que les usagers soient au courant et qu'ils soient impliqués dans le développement de telles politiques. Et en conclusion, Sheila mentionnait l'importance de parler aux usagers du transport en commun, tout en reconnaissant l'importance ou l'influence d'avoir une volonté politique pour amener des changements. Donc, voilà. Donc, je vais continuer en français pour une troisième question qui va s'adresser à Christine Gauvreau de la Société de transport de Laval. Donc, la question porte principalement sur le travail de refonte du réseau que vous faites à la STL, et qui va inclure plusieurs améliorations de services qui répondent aux besoins des femmes, donc notamment le service fréquent hors pointe. Et donc, la question qu'on se posait, c'est comment est-ce que ces améliorations répondent directement aux besoins des femmes, et comment est-ce que cela pourrait être mesuré et intégré dans la planification continue de la refonte ou de l'amélioration du service de transport en commun.
Est-ce qu'on traduit la question ou j'embarque tout de suite avec la réponse?
Oui, je peux traduire. So the question is about knowing that it is for Christine Gauvreau from the Société de transport de Laval, which is the second largest municipality in Quebec, just next to Montreal. And so the STL is now implementing network redesign, which will include many service improvements that will directly respond to women's need, namely frequent service and off-peak service. And the question we're interested in is to understand how these improvements will specifically meet the needs of women, and how could it be measured and integrated in future service improvement. Donc, je te laisse la parole.
Bon, merci Geneviève. Merci aussi à toi de m'avoir invité ici. C'est vraiment intéressant. On apprend toutes sortes de choses en fait, autour des questions et des différentes réponses et recherches qui ont été faites. Tu as mentionné que Laval, c'était la deuxième plus grande municipalité du Québec. Puis maintenant, avec les fusions et tout, là, on est 3/4e. Mais quand même, c'est une assez grande ville, 450 000 habitants. c'est quand même pas négligeable. C'est une banlieue de Montréal et c'est une banlieue qui tend à s'autonomiser de plus en plus, puisque de ce qu'on constate dans les derniers résultats d'enquête origine-destination, 45% de nos déplacements se font vers Montréal, la ville-centre, alors que 54% se font plutôt à l'intérieur de la ville de Laval. Donc, typiquement, le service de transport collectif d'une banlieue comme Laval s'organise beaucoup autour quand même d'amener les gens vers le centre-ville aux périodes de pointe, les travailleurs notamment en période de pointe, puis les ramener le soir, les jours de semaine évidemment. Ce que nous, on veut mettre en place, tu en as parlé un peu, là, mais c'est justement d'aller voir là où on pourrait ajouter du service, mais en lien aussi avec les reproches qu'on fait à notre service d'autobus via nos sondages satisfaction. On comprend que ce que les clients nous reprochent le plus, c'est justement notre service de fin de semaine et nos services hors pointe de jour et de soir là, qui ne sont pas suffisamment importants. Ils ne sont pas suffisamment importants parce que notamment la baisse d'achalandage est marquée. Alors, nos services, typiquement, suivent la quantité de personnes qu'on peut transporter. Mais des exercices comme celui qu'on est en train de faire nous amènent à se questionner justement sur comment on doit monter le service et pour qui. Nos clients sont majoritairement des femmes, pas de beaucoup, mais quand même un petit peu plus de clientèle féminine que masculine. Ceux qui s'expriment le plus dans nos sondages sont des femmes, mais là, c'est quand même plus marqué. Là, on voit 61% de femmes qui s'expriment dans nos sondages contre 39%. Donc, il faut ajuster le tir et écouter la voix féminine qui nous parle. Donc, nous, c'est un peu par la bande qu'on se doit répondre aux besoins des clientes féminines. J'avais noté là, Elba Higueros qui a mentionné que l'approche en transport en commun était Gender Neutral Approach. Effectivement, c'est ce que l'on fait typiquement. Mais là, on comprend que par la bande, en ajoutant du service hors pointe, on va venir vraiment répondre aux besoins des femmes qui ont des déplacements pour des motifs qui sont liés à la santé, au magasinage, aux loisirs, en fait, qui sont moins liés directement au travail et donc qui se font par la force des choses plus en période hors pointe. Et donc, en ajoutant du service hors pointe, on va venir répondre à la complexité particulière là, des déplacements des femmes. Comment on va pouvoir suivre en fait, ces ajouts de services-là? On a débuté en 2020, là, juste avant la COVID, on avait fait un premier jalon là, de notre plan d'amélioration de service qu'on veut poursuivre dès que possible, dès qu'on se remet un peu sur nos pieds. En fait, on va le suivre par nos sondages satisfaction. On va regarder spécifiquement là où on nous notait plutôt mal et au fur et à mesure qu'on va ajouter du service, on continue nos sondages, on les fait 2 fois par année, on va se revalider avec nos notes de satisfaction et on fera l'exercice différencié justement, puisqu'on comprend qu'on pourra aller rejoindre un certain nombre de besoins féminins, mais ce sera un suivi de sondage volet homme, volet femme qui nous permettra de voir dans quelle mesure on a visé juste. Fait que je te laisserai traduire.
Merci, Christine, pour cette réponse super intéressante. Donc, je vais résumer brièvement. So Christine was explaining briefly that Laval is a large suburban municipality. So typically, the transit agency was mainly concentrated on ensuring that individuals can reach the main employment center in Montreal. But it's changing fast, more and more. And today, 45% of the trips are made towards Montreal, whereas 54% are made inside Laval. So this brought the STL to really adjust the service to be more decentralized and also to address more directly non-work related trips. So as Elba was talking, that the reason for which women are doing trips differ sometimes from men. The same was seen in Laval and in the greater Montreal region. So trip purpose like health shopping, for example, they're less directly related to work and they're more often done off-peak. And related to the data, Christine was saying that they have satisfaction survey like many other agencies, and those are great tools to really understand what service improvements are desirable. And since they can include a gender component in that survey, they will use it in the future to assess the evolution of the network redesign and its impact, its differentiated impact in terms of perceptions by women and men. And so far in the satisfaction survey, the two most common remarks was the lack of off-peak frequency during the weekend, but also during the day between the peak hours and at night. So that's what they are addressing during the night, and they want to see in the future with their satisfaction survey how does these remarks or results differ from between men and women as the service evolve. I think that summarized, Christine, if I forgot anything you can add, but I think that summarized mainly the response of the STL, how general, so Christine was talking about how general and large service improvements can be used to address women's needs, and how can we be more knowledgeable about how they respond, how they better respond to women's needs.
Merci.
Merci, Christine. So David, I'll let it up to you for the next question in English.
Thank you, Jen. Next question's for Carrie Hott McDonald. Especially would love to hear your insights on this as you lead one of the largest transit agencies in Canada. So where can transit agencies start in terms of advancing policies and programs that can better serve the transit needs of women?
Thanks, David. That's a really good question. And I think, you know, on the surface, it can feel a little bit overwhelming when you start to peel these layers back and think about the magnitude of change that we need to navigate. You know, I do think, again, it starts with hiring more women. So promoting career paths for women. A lot of the feedback I've been receiving is people just don't realize what's available. And, you know, having a welcoming space is the first step towards encouraging people to pursue those opportunities. So again, at the leadership level, making sure we represent the communities we serve, and then throughout our entire organization, it's a big priority and it's an important part. I think, you know, my advice would be learn gender-based analysis, because it really starts with that. And there's some great free tools available out there. I think the federal government has a fantastic tool to start with, but really understanding what that is. So it's broader than, you know, it's specific in terms of a process, and it's also broader than just thinking about diversity and inclusion. And once I wrapped my head around that and really started to think again about the intersectionality of different factors, how to look at not just data, and I loved what Sheila had highlighted about actually talking and listening to people. You got to go beyond the data and hear the stories firsthand, and then applying what we're learning into our work. So there's a couple of really quick wins, I think, for a lot of us. And where we started was looking at safety and security. It's a topic, I think, that is really critical in terms of access and people feeling comfortable accessing transit. So we dug in a bit with some existing community groups within Edmonton that represented women and women's voices, had conversations to start, then kind of dug in a bit deeper about what do you hear, what do you identify as key priorities. And one of the simplest things was we didn't have a text message option for reporting security concerns. And it was such a cool thing to be able to introduce fairly quickly with our technology partners to give women, all users, and we always say, by making it safer for women, we're making it safer for everybody. So now people can either call or they can text us when they have any type of safety and security concerns while using the service. Another piece that we tackled right away, we were working on our on-demand transit pilot. So we have one of the largest pilots in North America. We've introduced on-demand service to 37 different neighborhoods and 16 seniors residences. And we consulted again with different groups, including women's groups, and heard great feedback about things like, what about my children? So do I have to bring a booster seat with me? What do I do with my stroller as I'm using the service? The design of the vehicles, the hours of service, all of those elements. We were able to have really good conversations and think about the needs a bit more distinctly, specific to families, specific to women and caregivers, and understand their needs a bit better, and then design it to meet those needs. And now that we're in our pilot test, we're able to, again, monitor how it's going, make adjustments, and learn from that. So I'd say try and find those quick wins, things maybe that are already in progress that you can incorporate a bit of a broader view and talk to people and then listen to their feedback.
Jen?
Yeah, thanks, Carrie, for this really interesting answer as well. And je vais continuer en français. Donc, je pense que Carrie mentionnait d'abord que ça peut sembler un peu un défi très difficile à réaliser quand on parle des changements importants qu'on doit faire pour justement améliorer la planification des transports en commun. Puis elle s'intéressait, mais elle se dit quand on regarde ça plus en détail, il y a plusieurs pistes de solutions qu'on peut implanter. Puis elle divisait ça un peu de deux façons générales. Donc, il y a les interventions spécifiques qu'on peut faire pour répondre à des besoins spécifiques chez les femmes, mais il y a aussi les changements plus larges en termes d'organisation, donc favoriser l'intégration des femmes dans la pratique, dans la profession de planification des transports en commun, autant dans des postes de leadership que dans des postes à tous les niveaux de l'organisation ou de l'agence de transport en commun. Donc, en parlant des interventions spécifiques, elle a donné quelques exemples, un peu comment apprendre des usagers et mettre en pratique ce qu'on apprend, en passant un peu, en identifiant un peu, pour commencer, les pistes qui sont les plus faciles à explorer. Donc, un exemple qu'elle a donné, c'est celui de la sécurité. Donc, d'un projet pour améliorer la sécurité dans les transports en commun, Edmonton a travaillé avec les groupes communautaires qui représentaient les femmes et une chose assez simple qui a été identifiée, c'est qu'il n'avait pas d'option de message texte pour rapporter des problèmes de sécurité, alors que c'est assez facile à implanter et c'est plus discret si on veut rapporter quelque chose lorsqu'on est dans le transport en commun. Et elle mentionnait ce qui est important aussi, puis on en a parlé dans la présentation, mais j'aimerais mettre l'accent aussi ici, c'est qu'on parle des femmes comme un groupe homogène. Il y a des expériences différenciées, mais aussi quand on implémente des choses qui vont rendre, par exemple, le transport en commun plus sécuritaire pour les femmes, mais ça va aussi le rendre plus sécuritaire pour l'ensemble des usagers, que ce soit des hommes, des femmes, qui vont ressentir des sentiments d'insécurité. Un autre exemple qu'elle mentionnait, c'est celui de la transport en demande. Donc, ils sont en train de travailler sur l'implantation d'un projet pilote de transport à la demande assez large. Et donc, dans le cadre de ce projet-là, il y a eu en effet une consultation avec les groupes communautaires. Et ça a amené des conversations très enrichissantes sur les besoins différenciés, même si ce n'était pas l'objectif à la base. L'objectif, c'était d'implanter un transport à la demande, mais en consultant différents groupes communautaires, il y a eu vraiment des insights, des pistes d'information intéressantes. Notamment, elle donnait comme exemple les questions sur les bancs d'enfants. Est-ce qu'on a besoin d'amener nos propres bancs pour les enfants? Est-ce qu'il y a déjà des enfants? Est-ce que c'est quoi les heures de service? Qu'est-ce qu'il va y avoir des heures de service le soir? Donc, ça permet vraiment d'amener un peu les considérations que certaines femmes ont, de les amener dans le processus de planification des transports en commun en passant par un projet spécifique de transport à la demande. Donc voilà, Carrie, if I forgot anything or did not mention something, please feel free. Great, all right. Okay, so I'll pass it up to David now for the next step.
Thank you, Jen. So this is our last moderated question, though we'll be sharing it to the audience Q&A. So if you're in the audience and you have a question, please put it into the Q&A tab. We have a few questions that we'll definitely walk through. So last questions for all panelists. So what can transit agencies do to collectively and advance and embody the recommendations from the study in your day-to-day planning and operations? So we have recommendations on gender-based data collection, on customer satisfaction surveys, on service standards, business cases, and the introduction of new technologies. So that's open to all panelists.
Donc, avant d'ouvrir le plancher pour les panélistes, je vais traduire en français la question finale un peu qui s'adresse à l'ensemble des panélistes. C'est par rapport aux recommandations qu'on a faites suivant les résultats qu'on a trouvés. Et c'est d'essayer de comprendre comment les agences de transport en commun peuvent ensemble aborder justement les différentes recommandations, que ce soit en matière de données, de politique ou de technologie.
Maybe I'll turn to Alba. There was a lot of conversation that really pertained to service standards and how you allocate service. And that's something that we were trying to trace and find through Canadian agencies. When the report was submitted back in 2019, how did the service start changing? Or is that process underway?
The service changed, fortunately for us, simultaneously to doing our study. We were also doing a redesign of our bus system. And so they incorporated gender data into that design. And so I responded in the chat, but it's our next gen bus plan. So the first time in over 20 years that we've looked at our system. And so we, through other data and incorporating gender data, we recognized that there were more off-peak trips occurring. And so there was a need to relook at our system. And so we have redesigned our system. And so today we have more than 80% of our customers can now catch a bus in 15 minutes or less compared to before. So it was just perfect timing of the report and this other initiative that was being taken on by the agency. But I will just add to the previous question, I think the most important component to this is, and someone else mentioned it, and I apologize, but it really is about making sure that leadership is on board, and that in order to really make the differences through these findings and recommendations, we need to present the case, understand the impact of not taking action, and the significance of that. And so I think having leadership, but having the voice throughout the transit agencies, I think it's very important to have women at the table to help be the advocates of the importance of this change that's needed. And so I think that is really the catalyst to moving this forward, is to have those voices at all levels of the agency. I think what was important at LA Metro is a lot of our ideas for improving transit for women came from our internal employees and their ideas and their experiences and what they observed, from bus operators all the way to leadership at top. So incorporating all those ideas and recommendations, and really not just listening, but being intentional with our actions, and being responsive was important, and will continue to be important.
Thank you, Alba. Any other of our panelists would like to add?
I'll just jump with the translation, otherwise
Yeah.
it'll be too much for me to translate. So thanks, Alba, for that answer. I think I'll emphasize the last part where you talk about the leadership and the employees. Donc, Alba mentionnait que c'est, comme dans le cas de la STL, il y a eu une refonte du réseau qui a vraiment pris en considération les données sur le genre, puis qui a mené à, par exemple, une meilleure fréquence de l'ensemble du service, puis du service à travers l'ensemble de la journée et pas seulement période de pointe. Et ce qu'elle mentionnait, c'est que pour faire une différence, c'est vraiment important que le leadership soit convaincu, soit impliqué dans ces changements-là. Et une façon de s'assurer que le leadership soit inclus, c'est d'avoir des femmes ou des employés qui représentent la diversité à tous les niveaux et qui peuvent justement convaincre ou mettre en lumière les enjeux vécus par les femmes. Et elle mentionnait, par exemple, que plusieurs des idées qui sont survenues dans le cadre de la refonte, puis de comment avoir des politiques qui bénéficient autant les femmes que les hommes, ça provenait d'employés qui étaient eux-mêmes des femmes, puis qui proposaient des solutions aux problèmes qu'elles-mêmes, elles expérimentaient, qu'elles vivaient. Donc, je pense que, en gros, ce qu'elle mentionnait, c'est l'importance justement de travailler à tous les niveaux pour faire des changements et pour s'assurer, convaincre les preneurs de décision de l'importance de ces interventions-là et aussi de l'importance des impacts qu'on aurait si on ne prenait pas d'action pour aborder justement les problématiques spécifiques vécues par les femmes.
Est-ce que je peux ajouter quelque chose? Oui. En fait, je réfléchissais en écoutant les différents panélistes, là, puis effectivement, bon, avoir plus de données, être capable de mieux comprendre le comportement des femmes, être appuyé par la politique, avoir plus de leadership, c'est toutes des choses qui font beaucoup de sens. Je me demandais dans quelle mesure il faudrait peut-être aussi couvrir la formation. Parce que typiquement, la formation pour travailler dans des domaines de planification comme ce que je fais comme métier, c'est une approche qui est justement très générale d'ingénierie, de manipulation de volume anonyme. Mais si on veut préciser un peu l'approche, puis justement l'amener à un niveau où on est plus spécifique sur les besoins des différentes clientèles, c'est peut-être dès le départ dans les universités, dans les cégeps où les formations se donnent, qu'on devrait intégrer ce genre de nuances-là pour qu'on soit mieux formé, justement outillé pour effectuer le travail adéquatement.
Donc, merci Christine pour un peu cette remarque et cette question que je vais lancer aussi aux autres panélistes. Puis je suis certaine aussi que les autres membres de l'équipe de projet ainsi que moi-même auront aussi des commentaires à faire à ce sujet-là. Donc, Christine was asking, she mentioned that she listened to all the panelists and she does agree that more data, understanding the needs, having political leadership support is really important. And then she asked, what about training? How do we train those that will be transport professionals so that they have more tools to address the nuances of the different lived experience and needs of the diversity? Here we talk about women, but bringing more nuances can help understand better and planning better for the whole diversity of users that do have needs in terms of public transport. And she was mentioning that most planners or transport professional comes from the typical engineering approach where we talk a lot about numbers and volumes and how to ensure that the network meets the demand in terms of numbers, but how can we better train at the college, like cégep here in Quebec or university level, those that will work in transport. So I'll open up the question to the other panelists, and then I'll let the other team members jump in if they have anything to add on that.
I would just say I completely wholeheartedly agree. I think this one size fits all approach to whether it's service design, planning, or looking at our policy, that definitely, we're at the tipping point, I think, of a bit of a paradigm change where we're thinking about tools like equity analysis, which is the next phase of our bus network redesign. So really looking at impacts, see where the gaps are, what do we need for our future annual service plans to address. So I think elevating, I'll say, and making it a bit more sophisticated what the suite of tools are for students to bring into these professions, to bring into the workplaces. And then within current workplaces, how do we educate our teams on some of those processes? So we have close partnerships with, as an example, our human resources area, our diversity and inclusion unit, who are able to help link us to really good quality education and then bring that to our teams as well. So tackling it from both entry point, people entering the profession. And I love the idea of broadening our thinking. I have a psychology degree. I'm not a transportation planner, just as an example. I think there's lots of different backgrounds that can contribute to a career path within the transit space.
Thanks, Carrie, for this complimentary and enriching response to Christine's comment. En gros, Carrie disait qu'elle était d'accord de tout cœur avec ce que Christine a dit. Elle parle d'un certain changement de paradigme. Donc, je pense qu'il y a un consensus un peu qu'il faut changer de façon importante les outils, garder ceux qu'on a, mais offrir aussi aux étudiants et professionnels une plus grande diversité d'outils qui sont disponibles pour faire la planification des transports. Donc, que les étudiants apprennent des méthodes plus diversifiées, puis se posent des questions plus nuancées, justement, là, de façon plus large sur la planification des transports. Puis elle parlait aussi de l'équipe de recrutement qui a une importance, justement, sur aller chercher des professionnels qui ont des backgrounds diversifiés, justement, que ce soit en termes d'éducation, d'expérience vécue. Puis elle donnait l'exemple super intéressant d'elle-même qui a un degré, un diplôme en psychologie, donc qui est très utile dans son cas pour diriger une agence de transport en commun, donc de ne pas se limiter à certains types de formation, puis vraiment d'être ouvert à une diversité de formation.
Sheila?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and add that if we want to advance this conversation about gender equity, we also need to be having a national conversation about transit operating funding, because especially in this critical moment, like such an important conversation where we're talking about how do we win back riders. And mostly we're talking about people commuting to work. And Priyanka did such a good job of talking about all the unwaged workers who rely on transit, especially during the pandemic, doing care work, childcare. And yeah, so I think there's maybe a challenge for transportation planners and agencies is to take an advocacy approach and say, this is what we need, and here's how much it costs, and that needs operating funding because there's a real crisis in the future of transit, and all that, by the same token, service that will benefit women. And then the last point is just that we really, others have said this, but to put, in a different perspective, we can't look at gender in isolation from racism and colonization, because we're talking about women's safety and we address that with more police, that's actually less safe for Black women and women of color. If we're talking about, there was some discussion earlier about how women take shorter trips. We try to solve that with fare by distance. That's going to have equity impacts, at least in Toronto, on people who live in the inner suburbs who are more likely to be racialized immigrants. So we can't look at that in isolation. And I forgot to mention earlier, so just to shout them out, the two reports I think are so important for this conversation. And one is the Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report that has a call to action around public transit, safe and affordable public transit. And then the other is a 2019 investigation by a journalist in the Globe and Mail about data around sexual assault and violence in transit systems. So just to kind of, again, make the point that a lot of the knowledge exists, and it's about, making use of it and listening to transit users, but then also looking at the big picture. This is about the future of transit and how it's funded, I think.
Okay, thanks, Shayla, for this other point of concern that is central to the discussion we're having here. Donc, Shayla mentionnait que si on veut vraiment aborder les besoins différenciés des femmes, c'est important d'avoir une conversation au niveau national sur le financement des agences de transport en commun. Donc, en ce moment, on parle beaucoup de comment retrouver les usagers après la pandémie, et la discussion est beaucoup axée sur le travail. Et donc, ce qu'elle propose, c'est que les agences adoptent une approche un peu militante afin de démontrer les besoins des femmes, puis aussi d'essayer de chiffrer combien ça coûterait. Je pense que les agences de transport en commun sont très conscientes de ces enjeux-là. Combien ça coûterait aux agences de transport en commun pour vraiment avoir un service de transport en commun qui répond à la diversité des besoins, notamment ceux des femmes. Puis, elle parlait aussi sur l'aspect important de l'intersectionnalité. Donc, c'est important de ne pas regarder les besoins des femmes de façon isolée, donc d'inclure les aspects de colonisation et d'origine ethnique qui vont avoir une influence vraiment différente sur les besoins. Donc, ce n'est pas un groupe homogène. Donc, merci de le rappeler, Sheila. Puis je pense qu'on va en parler davantage aussi dans la période de questions qui va suivre là, avec les questions qu'on a eues dans le chat. Et finalement, Sheila mentionnait deux rapports importants là, qui portent sur le sujet. So, Sheila, I didn't get time to really remember the names of the report. You can write it in the chat if you want, and we can share it with the participants. I think that'll be the easiest way to share the information.
Thank you, Jen. I'm going to turn it over to the audience Q&A. So the first question is, based on experience and research, would there be any regional differences in goals and approaches? I'm going to tackle that question, overseeing the policy review. The answer is there wasn't actually any regional differences on looking at the policy frameworks of looking at women's travel patterns on transit and the prioritization or assessment of them. It was very much more about what Elba spoke of was, did the agency actually make it a priority? Is there a policy framework and a direction set from leadership, either at the political level or the senior leadership of the agency to do that? And that's where we actually saw most of the work that's been started or commenced on this particular elements of how we plan transit service. The piece that was interesting in reaching out to the 18 agencies, and they were all providing an opportunity to provide additional thoughts, commentary, and materials, is that a lot of agencies are actually just starting this conversation. there is a universal acceptance and understanding that we need to better understand women's travel needs on transit, but everyone's at a different stage and different set, and the ones that are further ahead are the ones that have very publicly said this is a priority, and the other ones are starting that journey to understand how we can actually work forward on this topic. Jen?
Yes. Okay. So the question was about from the public was whether there were regional differences and how women's needs were addressed in transport planning. And David mentioned that as he led the policy review, what they found is that the needs and travel behavior don't differ much between regions, as we saw with the LA Metro report, which is very similar to what we observe in different Canadian cities. The main difference is whether agencies or cities or governments make it a priority to consider women's needs in their plans. And I take also this opportunity to mention that what we focused on in this project. Je devrais être en français, hein?
Oui.
Merci, Christine. OK, donc j'ai traduit en anglais, je vais retraduire en français. Donc, oui, donc la question, c'était à propos de savoir s'il y avait des différences régionales dans la prise en considération des besoins des femmes en transport en commun. Et donc, la principale réponse, c'est qu'il n'y avait pas de différence importante en termes de comportement de mobilité. Donc, comme on l'a vu avec le rapport de LA Metro, on observe vraiment des tendances similaires, peu importe la région. Où on observe des différences, c'est auprès des gouvernements ou des agences de transport en commun qui en ont fait une priorité de s'intéresser directement aux besoins des femmes. Puis, c'est important aussi de mentionner que ce qu'on a fait dans le cadre de notre étude, c'est vraiment de regarder les documents publics et ce qui est explicite. Donc, on n'a pas, c'est un projet d'1 an, donc on n'avait pas un temps illimité, donc on n'a pas non plus vu tout ce qui se fait à l'interne. Et c'est pour ça qu'on a organisé notamment ce webinaire-là, pour avoir un peu une vue de tout ce qui est fait à l'interne, puis qui n'est peut-être pas explicitement ou publiquement mentionné.
Thank you, Jen. Next question is going to be for Priyanka as part of the research process. So the questions pertaining to mothers who travel with strollers and car seats and other devices that assist with traveling with children. Was that category distinctly discussed in the literature, especially during rush hour time periods or time periods where it might be a bit more challenging to access transit if you have a car seat or a stroller with you on board?
Yeah, definitely. So that came up in the literature quite a bit because it is something that women deal with frequently. And it adds to the reason why women are still driving or being passengers more often than they are taking transit. And what we had found that from literature coming out of the US was that some of the agencies there will even require women to fold strollers before coming on board transit vehicles. So I think that's something that Canadian transit systems are doing really well, that we do have that priority seating. Many buses have the fold up so you can just put your stroller straight on board. And I think how do we address these needs is that spreading the peak is a big initiative many transit agencies are doing. And that is something that helps all riders, including women. So by spreading the peak and just reducing crowding on these vehicles, I think that would help for women traveling with strollers and car seats. I don't know if anyone has anything else to add.
I would just jump in and add one more thing, I think building off of a comment that Sheila made. Sheila, you mentioned about how crowding standards should be more inclusive to thinking about capacity for strollers or say wheelchair at the front of the bus. And I think that's something that certainly we didn't come across in our literature review, but I think having a conversation about that would be a really interesting path forward.
Can I add another component to crowding of buses also? Crowding of buses also leads to safety concerns. Sexual harassment happens more when there is a crowded environment. So there's also that consideration of impacts of a crowded bus.
Donc, merci pour ces réponses. Donc, en gros, on parlait la question portait à savoir si on considérait les besoins des mères d'avoir des poussettes là, dans leur déplacement, ce qui nous amenait à parler beaucoup de l'entassement dans les autobus. Donc, le fait que plus le bus est entassé, plus c'est compliqué de se déplacer avec une poussette. Puis Priyanka soulignait que les agences de transport en commun au Canada font déjà beaucoup de place à l'utilisation de la poussette en ayant des espaces réservés, par exemple, tandis que dans certaines agences aux États-Unis, on demande aux personnes ayant des poussettes de les fermer avant d'entrer dans l'autobus. Donc, ça complique vraiment les déplacements. Et un enjeu important qui est lié à l'entassement, c'est celui de la sécurité. Donc, Carrie mentionnait qu'il y a un plus grand risque d'harcèlement sexuel lorsque l'autobus est bondé. Et donc, l'importance de considérer un peu les normes, dans les normes de service, les enjeux d'achalandage et d'entassement des autobus. Et Priyanka parlait aussi, pour réduire justement l'entassement des autobus, d'élargir la pointe, donc d'essayer de développer des façons à ce que les usagers n'utilisent pas tous le transport en commun à 8 heures le matin, par exemple, mais d'élargir la période d'utilisation. And that answer, I'll mention it in English because there was a question about clarifying what we mean by spreading the peak. So maybe Priyanka, I can let you answer that one, just a clarification about what do we mean when we say spreading the peak?
Yeah, sorry about that. So spreading the peak would just be initiatives by transit agencies to reduce crowding at these peak times. So let's say the morning rush to a downtown area, that would be a peak time, let's say of like 8 a.m. So by encouraging riders to travel at off-peak times, that would reduce the crowdedness. And that can be done by either fare policies or by having more constant frequent service throughout the day. Things like that would reduce peak periods of travel.
Thank you, Jen and Priyanka. I'm going to move to the next question, which I will direct to Emily, and I might support it as well. Gender equity should capture trans, queer, intergender, non-binary identities. How and why was it decided to focus solely on women?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and one that we probably glanced over quite quickly. But there are several reasons for that decision. We absolutely agree that gender equity is not gender equity in the context of what we looked at, say, men versus women's travel patterns, is not representative of true gender equity. However, when we started our literature review and our policy review, we really came to realize that looking at, say, women's travel patterns was a pretty good start forward. However, the literature alone on that topic, say, within the context of Canada, was quite limited and quite scant. And so what we would say, sort of moving forward in a larger project, is adopting a more inclusive consideration to gender and gender equity. And hoping that, say, the work that we did here would encourage other researchers to, say, build upon what we did and look at gender from a more inclusive lens. And I think it also lends to the conversation we were having before about thinking about more interdisciplinary approaches to transport planning from an academic side, policy side, or even from who's educating future transport professionals, to think more about gender and equity. I think is a really important way to move forward. David, you want to add to that?
No, I think you captured it. There's a huge intersectionality to this, and this is we're looking to start the conversation and have a much broader conversation that looks at all these different elements, and it's not a way to say it's not important that we didn't touch on this part. It's just we want to start the elements of this, and I agree with Emily. It's how we research, it's how we teach, it's how we look at these different perspectives, and we need those voices at the table as well in this conversation. Jen?
Oui, donc la question qui nous a été posée, c'est à propos du fait que l'équité des genres devrait encapsuler et considérer les identités trans, queer, troisième genre et des identités non binaires. Et on nous demandait pourquoi ou comment on a décidé de se concentrer seulement sur les femmes. Et bon, Émilie mentionnait que c'était une question très pertinente qu'on s'est posée dans le cadre de notre mandat, qui n'a pas nécessairement reçu autant d'attention qu'il aurait pu en recevoir. On est absolument d'accord que de comparer les hommes versus les femmes, c'est loin d'être représentatif de l'équité des genres. Toutefois, c'était comme une piste d'entrée pour étudier, comprendre un peu comment les genres peuvent influencer les besoins de mobilité et comment ceux-ci peuvent être considérés dans la planification des transports. Et donc, les prochaines étapes qu'on souhaite, donc comme je le mentionnais, c'était la première année du projet. Les prochaines étapes qu'on souhaite, les directions dans lesquelles on souhaite aller, c'est d'être plus inclusif dans l'équité des genres, justement. Puis, on espère que l'étude, c'est un commencement qui va nous amener à aller plus loin dans les besoins différenciés en termes d'identité des genres, mais aussi d'intersectionnalité, comme ça a été mentionné. Et on parlait d'une approche multidisciplinaire, donc David et Emily l'ont rappelé. Donc, l'idée, c'est vraiment d'avoir une approche disciplinaire et encore une fois, dans la suite du projet, on veut élargir la multidisciplinarité. Donc, on a des perspectives un peu différentes, mais qui s'alignent quand même dans le domaine traditionnel de la planification des transports. Donc, on souhaite aussi élargir cette multidisciplinarité-là, autant dans le projet de recherche qu'au sein, j'imagine, des agences de transport en commun.
Just seeing we have a few minutes left, I'd like to really thank our four panelists today for joining us and supporting this project. A lot of inspiration comes from the four of you and the work that you do, and you're absolute leaders in the space. And as a project team, we really appreciate your support on this particular topic, and look for ways to continue to advance this on the policy agenda. So thank you, Elba, Christine, Sheila, and Carrie. We sincerely are quite thrilled to have you here and support this particular project. Just a few closing next steps. As mentioned, we will be submitting our final report by the end of this year. We will circulate it as well to all the attendees of this webinar, and it'll also be posted online. And as well as I will circulate the presentation deck from today so that you have that on file as well. So I'll turn over to Jen for concluding remarks.
Donc, merci. Malheureusement, on est déjà au moment de la conclusion parce que le temps s'écoule. Donc, on tient à remercier tous les participants, tous les panélistes qui ont vraiment donné leur temps pour participer activement puis de façon engagée là, à la discussion. C'est très inspirant de notre côté là, pour poursuivre ce projet de recherche-là. Ça nous a amené des pistes de questions, des pistes de solutions pour la suite des choses. Je remercie aussi les participants. On a eu vraiment aussi un grand intérêt de la part des participants. Puis les questions, malheureusement, on n'a pas pu répondre à toutes les questions ici, mais c'est certain qu'on les prend en note pour la suite des choses, puis qu'on va essayer de les intégrer dans notre rapport comme tel. Puis David mentionnait là, en réponse à la question de Mme Tivierge sur la possibilité d'avoir une copie du rapport, bien, suite au webinaire, on vous fera parvenir la présentation comme telle, mais on va aussi, lorsque le rapport sera publié, donc vers la fin de l'année, on va le partager avec tous les gens qui se sont inscrits à ce webinaire-là. Et n'hésitez pas à nous contacter si vous avez des questions ou des commentaires. Et donc voilà, ça conclut un peu la présentation. Puis David, Emily, moi, Joseph et Priyanka, on souhaite un peu à mentionner le fait que c'est le début d'un projet, qu'on souhaite aller plus loin, puis qu'on voit cette volonté-là vraiment de la part de toutes les personnes à qui on a participé, autant auprès des agents de transport en commun que des participants ou des groupes communautaires. Donc, on est vraiment intéressés à avoir vos commentaires, vos questions suite à ce webinaire.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Merci beaucoup. Bonne fin de journée, peu importe où que vous soyez dans le Canada ou en Amérique du Nord.
Merci.
Bye.
Bye.